Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the GSMC television podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Chad, and this week I'm focusing on documentaries. So if you tuned into my Sunday podcast, talked about a couple of documentaries, Q, Into the Storm, and Operation Varsity Blues, the college admission scandal. And I've got two more for you today. The first is an Oscar-nominated documentary on Netflix called My Octopus Teacher. This film was all the rage in 2020 as we were all locked down in our homes. Netflix brought us this touching tale of a free diver and an octopus learning about life together, and it's now been nominated for an Oscar, so I'll be talking about that today. The other documentary I'm going to be talking about is one that I'm 4 episodes in on this documentary series. It's called Age of Samurai, Battle for Japan, also on Netflix. Can't wait to talk to you guys about that. And then, as we've been doing the past couple podcasts, I'm going to be ending with my segment, Things I Learned About Television This Week, where we'll talk about the 93rd Oscars, which are going to be airing on the 25th of April, and some of the things that they're doing this year for the telecast due to COVID and some other things. So stay tuned to the end so we can talk about that. All right, so we're going to jump in. I watched My Octopus Teacher back in 2020. I had been hearing about it. It was in the top 10 on Netflix for a while, and I thought, you know what? Let's check it out. I recently went back and rewatched it in preparation for today's podcast. And if you haven't seen it, highly recommend checking it out. And I'll explain why in a moment. My Octopus Teacher, it's been nominated for Best Documentary in this year's Oscars. It was released in 2020, directed by Pippa Ehrlich and James Reed. And it documents time spent by filmmaker Craig Foster as he basically spent a year free diving off the coast of South Africa in this 200-meter kelp pool. And while doing that, he developed a relationship with an octopus. And I know that sounds kind of interesting, which is why I watched it the first time. I've now watched it twice. It was just as interesting the second time. So basically, here's the deal. Craig Foster starts this film talking about his life. Craig grew up in South Africa, and he was kind of reflecting on growing up in this small wooden hut right at the waterline of the Atlantic Ocean. And so whenever there was a big storm and the waves got high enough, it would actually go over the rocks and flood the bottom level of their home, of their hut. And he remembers this fondly. I don't know that I would remember that fondly, but he does. And he's talking about kind of his childhood and how he grew up in the water. He's a free diver. He's been doing it his entire life. And he starts to kind of reminisce on how, as he got older, things kind of changed. And, he started working and focusing on work, and it was more kind of about, growing up and being involved in kind of the rat race, the thing that we all end up kind of dealing with once we get out of our childhood. And he talks about this experience as an adult. He's, been working as a filmmaker. He goes with his brother to the Kalahari, and he spends 2 years filming a documentary following Native people as they kind of work through their lives. And he has this experience during that 2 years that resonates with him. And that experience is he and his brother goes out with the tribal hunters, and they're going on this hunt, and he's watching as these men armed with just spears and primitive bows and arrows begin to track their prey. And they're doing it by paying attention to these really minute details in nature. And he's talking about how these people have developed this connection to the land, to the natural world around them, that allows them to see things that normal people don't see, as they're working through this necessity of hunting for food. And he begins to make this connection to how that isn't present for him anymore. He felt like he had a connection, a different connection to nature when he was a child, growing up in South Africa in this wooden hut of a home at the water line, where nature was literally coming into his home regularly in the form of these waves crashing into the lower level of his house. And that's gone now. He doesn't have that anymore. He's not at that point anymore. And so after a number of years of working as a filmmaker, and he finishes this documentary with his brother, he returns home, and he's really, really bothered by what he's thinking about, these connections that he's making in his life to this kind of lack of a larger purpose, connection, and it really throws him into kind of turmoil. And he's sharing these very intimate kind of thoughts about how he doesn't feel connected to not just the natural world, but even the people around him, the people in his life, specifically his son. And so he decides to go diving. He decides to get back into the water after many years. And so he's in South Africa. He returns to where he grew up, and he decides to go out and free dive. And so he talks about getting back into the water for the first time. He talks about it in these very kind of elegant, very visceral terms that really draw this picture in your mind, and get you in there with him. You can literally feel, in some ways, the cold water that, as he's describing what that feels like when he's getting back into the water for the first time. And he's a free diver. He's a free diver because that's his kind of chosen way of diving. He prefers free diving, but there's also a practical reason for free diving. So where he lives, there's these kelp forests in the ocean. And so he doesn't wear scuba tanks because it can get caught in the kelp. It's much easier and safer to swim without the tanks to get caught in this kelp, and so he can go places more freely and more safely. So he doesn't use tanks, but he also chooses not to wear a wetsuit because he wants to feel nature. He wants to get connected and grounded in this natural world again, as he witnessed the tribesmen in Africa and recalls his connection as a child. And so he goes out and he starts diving. And, his first couple dives are kind of not really any big deal. He's just kind of diving. He's getting back in it. He's acclimating to the cold water and the hard waves pushing against him, and he talks about how difficult it is to dive in this particular cape of South Africa. And he's kind of exploring around, and he finds this 200-meter pool that has clear water. It's like the water is calmer, and so he's able to really see more things. And so he starts kind of exploring this pool. And it's not long before he encounters this octopus. It's a common octopus. It's a small female. And he kind of begins to observe the octopus. And he notices that she seems to be aware of his presence, but is very kind of apprehensive of him, to the point where she's kind of staying in her little rock den. But what drew him to the octopus in the first place is he's diving around and he sees this odd ball on the floor of the ocean. And this ball is literally covered in seashells. And it's slowly moving across the seafloor. And it's because this octopus has literally taken all of these shells and she's made kind of like a camouflage of shells all around her, and then is just kind of slowly moving through. And as he got closer, she shed her shells and shot into her den. And so this behavior that he sees, it intrigued him, and that's what kind of prompted him to kind of pay attention to this octopus. He had never seen a behavior like that before. And so he literally makes a decision that he's going to come back the next day and the next day, and he's going to continue to come back and observe this octopus. And so it takes almost a week and a half before the octopus kind of starts to show signs of warming up to him. And within the first month of him doing these daily dives, he finally has contact. The octopus kind of reaches one of its tentacles up out of its den and touches him. And this physical contact with this natural creature really impacts him. He gets really deeply connected to her after that. And he decides that he's going to literally swim in that area, go back to the octopus den every day. He's going to check in on her every day. Now, apparently he's done some research, and common octopus have a lifespan of about a year. And so when he makes this decision to dive with this octopus daily, he does so knowing that it's finite. That amount of time that he's going to be doing this is limited to no more than a year because of the natural life cycle. And he thinks it's pretty early in that year based on the size of the octopus and so on and so forth. And so he does that, and he literally talks about how he's going and he's diving every year or every day, and the octopus continues to get more and more comfortable with him being around. And because he's diving with this octopus daily, he's getting to see more and more about the octopus behavior, what octopus do, or octopi, I guess, do when they're just going through their life in the natural world. And we get to this first kind of point of conflict when we get to day 52. He literally has been diving every day now for 52 days. And he's building a map of the octopus world with the den in the center of the world, and then kind of branching out from there. And he's marking different natural landmarks. He's marked where the predators' dens are. So one of the big predators of common octopus apparently is a pajama shark, and there's a den full of them nearby in this kelp forest. And so he's marked that. He's just learning a little bit more about her world, the octopus's world, every day, and he's making a map of it. And he's also documenting this with photos and video as he's going along, and the images are just fantastic. Beautiful, beautiful images. If you've ever seen a nature documentary where they're kind of focused on underwater creatures, I mean, that's one of the most beautiful things, I think, to watch on television. Super relaxing, and his images are just phenomenal. And so on day 52, this conflict happens where a pajama shark is swimming around and finds the octopus. Apparently, pajama sharks, they have really crappy vision, but their sense of smell is like really super acute, and they've got these like flat heads, so they can kind of stick them in between the rocks. And so despite the octopus's attempts to hide from the pajama shark, he finds her, and he grabs one of her tentacles and begins this kind of death spin, almost like the images that you may have seen of alligators and crocodiles, where they grab a hold of their prey and then they spin them around and spin them around and spin them around. That's what this shark is doing with this octopus tentacle in his mouth. And it's not long before the tentacle breaks off and the shark goes swimming away, and Craig is left kind of describing this moment of panic. He's now seeing his friend, this octopus, is now lost a tentacle, and he doesn't know her condition. He doesn't know if she's okay. He doesn't know if she's alive, because all he can see is her kind of hiding, recessed under these rocks, with the blood from the tentacle, and he's deathly afraid that blood is going to churn up more pajama sharks. And he has to, in this moment, make a decision. And that decision he has to make is, does he help? Does he involve himself in nature? Or does he continue to just observe it? And after 52 days, he's developed a relationship with this octopus, a very real connection. And so this is a challenging decision for him. And he ultimately decides he's not going to do anything. He's going to let her be, let nature kind of happen. And he ends his dive for the day, determined to come back the next day and check on her. And so that's where we're going to pause. We're going to pause my recap of My Octopus Teacher there, take our first break. When we come back, I'm going to pick it up, and we'll finish off talking about this super awesome documentary, My Octopus Teacher, on Netflix. Stay tuned.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Television Podcast with your host, Chad. We are talking about documentaries this week, and I'm halfway through my recap of an Oscar-nominated documentary called My Octopus Teacher on Netflix that was released in the midst of the pandemic last year. So where we left off, it was day 52. Craig's friend, the octopus, has been attacked by a pajama shark, lost a tentacle, and he's had to make the difficult decision not to involve himself in nature, to not get involved, to not try to, rescue or save or do anything. So he goes back the next day, and he goes looking for the octopus, and he does find her, and she's in her den. But she's not really moving. She's not leaving the den to feed. She's just kind of in the den. And so he continues to come back. And after a few days, he's noticing that she appears to be getting weaker. And he talks about how he believes that she's getting weaker because she's no longer got the strength to change the colors. Her color now is just kind of pale. And octopuses, like cuttlefish, they have this ability to kind of change colors to fit their environment. And so she's not doing that right now. It's like all of her energy is being spent on healing, and she's not eating. And so it's been several days, and he doesn't know how she's getting food. Because he's, only there for a short time when he's diving with her every day. And so he doesn't know, is she leaving at night and getting food or whatnot. And so he's concerned. It's been several days. She's clearly injured. And so he decides that he is going to get involved. And he shows himself with his diving knife and a mollusk of some sort. And he kind of cracks the shell open and pushes it, kind of toward the den, and allows her to grab it with her tentacle and eat. We don't know how long that continued, how long he continued to feed her. But what we do know from his account is that it took about 3 months for her tentacle to grow back. It was kind of a slow process, and eventually, after about 3 months, there was like a small tentacle. It was fully formed, but it was really small. And so at that point, she starts to become more active, and she's going out and she's doing things again. She's going on her kind of daily explorations and starting to feed and doing all those things. And so right then and there, kind of prompts this question in your mind of, well, what would have happened if he hadn't fed her? Would she still have recovered if he wasn't feeding her? And so I thought that was kind of an interesting question that kind of came into my mind as I was watching this. But he continues to spend these days observing behaviors. And he starts coming, normally he dives during the day, and he's observing her as she's hunting during the day. And he talks about observing her on a hunt when she's trying to catch a crab. And he talks about the crab being kind of outgunned, so to speak, because his octopus friend was so much smarter and faster and more agile as she kind of moves through the water like liquid, as he describes it. He uses these wonderful, wonderful descriptions to talk about the things that he sees in her world. And she catches this crab and goes to eat it, and all of a sudden he's concerned because while she's eating, there's the blood and all the stuff kind of floating around, because apparently octopuses are not the cleanest eaters. And there's these like spiny starfish that start coming in droves toward her den to try to get their little bits of her food, kind of thing, and to the point where they're literally kind of crawling all over her. And Craig is really kind of concerned. He's like, okay, what's going to happen now, kind of thing, as he's observing this behavior. And he talks about how the first day, it's like she's overwhelmed. It's like these starfish have just kind of overwhelmed her. They've overrun her den. But that over time, he begins to see her figure out how to deal with the starfish. And he begins to see her just taking a tentacle and grabbing them and tossing them out of her den one by one, to free herself of this nuisance. And this is where he continues to kind of, or begins rather, to talk about her as an intelligent being and not just a wild animal, a creature that's capable of learning and thinking and impacting kind of the world around her with her actions. And so he illustrates this by talking about her hunting technique with lobster. So she has a technique that works really well with crabs and other mollusks. But when she applies the same hunting technique to a lobster, the lobster gets away. Doesn't matter how she does it, how clever or how fast she is, the lobster always gets away. And after a few days of observation, he shares that she changed her tactic. She literally uses him as part of her hunting tactic, where she swings around behind the lobster and positions the lobster between herself and Craig, the observer. And then instead of reaching for the lobster, she just kind of jumps up and envelops it with her body. So doesn't use her tentacles like she would with a crab to catch it. She envelops this lobster after using Craig as kind of a wall, a barrier to prevent the lobster from running forward on her. And he found this fascinating. And so it prompts him to try to see what happens at night. because he's always diving with her during the day. So he decides to free dive at night. Now, I'm sorry. I don't do water. I don't do water, period. I don't do pools. Don't do it. So the idea of getting into the water at night in a kelp forest just doesn't seem like a good idea to me. But Craig apparently is one with nature now, so he legit just goes for it. And again, he continues to provide these beautiful descriptions of what he experiences and the differences between diving at night and diving during the day. And it's a good thing that he did this, because he's able to observe these changes in his octopus friend's behavior. At night, she is hunting, but she's hunting in more shallow water. She actually goes to the shallow tide pools at night to hunt, and has a lot of success getting food there in those shallow pools at night. And this is a behavior that's different from what he sees during the day. So she has two different kind of hunting behaviors depending on the time of day. And this continues to fascinate him. And he begins to talk more about how this relationship with this octopus is impacting his life. And he's talking about how he doesn't use the word obsessed, but the way he's describing it, it's almost as though this is becoming an obsession. He's thinking about the octopus at all times. When he's asleep, he's dreaming about this octopus. And it's really, really interesting to kind of hear him very calmly speaking of this kind of obsession with being with this octopus. And it's helped a little by the fact that he begins to draw these connections to his time spent in the water in her world, and how it's helping him to connect to his world at a deeper level. And he begins to talk about his son, and how his son is getting older, is also a diver. And he begins to build a deeper connection with his son by sharing his diving experiences with him. So he's taking his son out free diving with him. He's introduced him to the octopus. And it's around day 250 that he's talking about how his son and his relationship is deepening. So as the documentary goes on, he begins to talk about how he's in the water around day 325 of consecutive dives with this octopus. And he finds that she's not behaving the way she normally does. And he isn't quite sure why that is. But it doesn't take him long to realize that there is a pajama shark nearby. And it's swimming around, trying to find her. And he gets, spun up. He's very anxious again because he's remembering the last time she encountered a pajama shark. And he watches as she kind of leaves this rock outcropping and begins to kind of float with the kelp. And she takes the kelp leaves and she kind of wraps herself in the kelp, trying to hide her scent from the shark and camouflage herself in the hopes that the shark will just kind of leave. And the shark, smelling all of these smells coming from the kelp, just starts biting blindly at the different kelp, trying to find her. And she eventually kind of shoots off, making a run for it, and the shark is on her pretty quickly. And as she kind of sprays her ink and is able to get away from him just long enough to begin grabbing shells. And he watches this behavior that he hasn't seen since that first day, where she takes all of these shells. He describes it as 100+ shells, and she makes this like suit of armor around her and uses her tentacles in the shells to cover her delicate head for protection. And she balls up on the bottom of the ocean floor, waiting. And the pajama shark attacks, and we see him trying to bite down on her, but he can't because there's all of these shells, and he keeps just biting the shells and can't get into her, and they're moving kind of through the water together as he's trying to get to the octopus. And Craig is left in this horrible position because he wants to see this. He needs to see what's going to happen, but he's running out of air because he's a free diver. So he's got to run back up to the surface and grab air, and then he runs back down. And I'm saying running. Obviously, he's not running because he's in the water, so he's totally swimming back down. And he's heightening this intensity by telling us this. And he gets back down and he finds the pajama shark, only he doesn't find him the way he expects. He literally finds his octopus friend sitting on the back of the pajama shark as the pajama shark is swimming through the water trying to find her. And he says now she's got the upper hand. She's outthought the shark because she's on his back. It's the safest place she could possibly be. And she continues to ride this shark as Craig is observing until she gets to a place where she's a little bit closer to her den, and she shoots off real quick and gets into the den, and is able to get deep enough in the rocks that when the pajama shark comes around, he's not able to get to her. And Craig, continues to kind of talk about her intelligence, and he's super happy that she's fine. So as we get to the end of the documentary, he talks about a day when he goes into the water and he finds that there is another octopus sitting near the den of his octopus friend. And he realizes what's happening. It's a male octopus, and it's time for them to mate. And so he begins to talk about this moment in the relationship, this moment in the octopus's life that he knew was coming. He knew when he started this that the day was going to come, where his octopus friend would mate and lay her eggs and then die. Because apparently that's the life cycle. They mate, they have the babies, they die. And he's now beginning to look at this day with dread. She's not leaving her den. She's not hunting or feeding. She's just staying in her den. And she's nursing and caring for, watching over this process of having these babies. And he describes it as she's giving her life to them. And this goes on for an unspecified number of days. And then he goes down and he finds her outside of her den, and she's dying. And the fish are coming, and they're all taking their little nibbles at her, and he observes for a while, and then the next day he comes back and she's in the same place, looking worse for wear, and a pajama shark comes by and grabs her and carries her body off. We never see the babies. He really focuses on her and her life. But what we do get is this kind of final reflection on what he's learned from spending this over 320 some days with this octopus. And he talks to us in relation to his son, who's now a year older, a stronger swimmer, and has become connected to nature in a different way as well. And we see these images of them swimming together, and he talks about how on one of their trips, they're going out, consistently to swim together, and he's trying to teach to his son everything that he's learned. And his son's building this connection, and on one of their dives, his son finds a baby octopus. And we get this image of this baby octopus as it kind of plays within the fingers of his son. And that's kind of how the documentary ends. Is this kind of beautiful, reflection on life and the regenerative nature of life and our children and Craig, like most documentaries, there's kind of the typed message at the end, and apparently Craig went from diving alone every day with this octopus to continuing his dives, but he doesn't dive alone. He actually started a charity, a nature charity that has others coming out with him on his dives, and he's sharing kind of what he's learned of the natural world with them, and the charity focuses on ocean conservation. I'm not surprised that this documentary was nominated for an Oscar. It is a beautiful, beautiful documentary. It runs about an hour and a half. And I know that it might seem repetitive, the fact that he's like diving every day and just kind of swimming around, and how interesting can that be? I highly recommend checking it out. It is a very easy watch. And the way it's shot and the way it's presented and the way he speaks of his experience is just absolutely phenomenal and so beautiful. I highly encourage you to watch it. My Octopus Teacher on Netflix, nominated for an Oscar this year for Best Documentary. All right, we are going to take a break. When we come back, we are going to talk about Age of Samurai, the battle for Japan. And then we are going to wrap up today's podcast with my segment, Things I Learned About TV Today, so stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the GSMC Television Podcast with your host, Chad. We're talking about documentaries. Before the break, I talked about a documentary called My Octopus Teacher on Netflix, and we're going to keep this Netflix documentary train a-rolling as we talk about one that I'm about halfway through right now, Age of Samurai, Battle for Japan. This is an American documentary on Netflix that is set in feudal Japan and covers a 65-year period from 1551 to 1616. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've had a little bit of an opportunity to do some traveling. I've never been to Asia, but that's one of those kind of places that's always been on my bucket list, and one of the ones that I'm looking most forward to someday visiting is Japan. I just find so much about Japan and the culture to be very interesting. My grandmother is of Japanese heritage, so I feel a connection there, and so when I was kind of flipping through Netflix, this documentary just showed up in my, suggestions or whatever. The algorithm decided that it was going to suggest it to me. And I'm about halfway through the documentary. I'm on episode 4 of a 6-episode series. And this one is done very much like some of the documentaries you might have seen on History Channel. It's a drama series where they take kind of factual events and they dramatize them with actors. It is narrated in English, and then when the actors are speaking, they're speaking in Japanese with subtitles. So as long as you're okay reading a little bit, there's not a lot of reading of subtitles, but as long as you're good with reading a little bit, this will be an easy watch for you. And it's only 6 episodes. It's a pretty quick series to binge through, and I'm enjoying it. So it covers the final years of the Sengoku period of Japan. That's the age of warring states, where Japan was controlled by several powerful daimyo, or warlords. So it wasn't always a unified country. These warlords all have their own territories that they kind of rule over. And during this period, the predominant kind of soldier is the samurai. So all of these daimyos, they have their own army of samurai, and then that's kind of their elite forces. And then they fill that out with villagers and other, kind of amateur soldiers. And samurai in Japan is almost like a culture in and of itself. I mean, it's got its own rules, and these were people who were kind of the first professional soldiers of that age in Japan. That's literally all they did was fight battles, and they were extremely good at it. They wore very specific leather armor. They had very specific types of weapons that were used, everything from long spears to the samurai sword or katana, which you probably know from movies like Kill Bill, or if you've seen anything that has to do with samurais, Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, any of those. But they also carried a secondary sword, a short sword, as well. And so the warlords all had their territories. They had their armies made up of these elite forces, the samurai, and their farmers. And they all have this one goal, right? Warlords, they want to expand their territory. And at that time, expanding your territory was seen as an effort to unify Japan under a single ruler or shogun. Shoguns are basically military dictators They're usually appointed by the emperor. And so it was one of those things that if you could take over more territory, and if you could unite all of the territories under one daimyo, then the emperor would basically anoint you as the shogun, and you would rule Japan as a military dictatorship for all intents and purposes, with just the emperor kind of above you, but not really, because, you are a warlord and you got all these soldiers. So when the series starts, it's focused on one warlord in particular, a man by the name of Oda Nobunaga. He basically is the son of a daimyo who ascends to power following the death of his father. And in classic, ruling family style, it doesn't happen bloodlessly. He ends up killing his brother and his brother's wife, and there's all kinds of bloodshed trying to get, his foothold established as the head of the Oda clan, because the thing that you don't want when you're a warlord is somebody in your family that's, plotting against you. So usually getting rid of all those people is the best way to go, apparently. He is known in history, Oda Nobunaga, as being someone who ruled through fear and strength. This was one of those very no-nonsense kind of guys. He expected absolute loyalty at all times, and he did not suffer fools or failure very well. And so we see, as they're working through episode 1, kind of how he goes about establishing his dominance, his rule within his clan. And he has to have kind of, he's not going to lead every battle, right? He can't be everywhere. And so he surrounds himself with a couple of handpicked top generals that he's fought with in the past, that he knows are loyal to him. And those are the people that he's really leaning on as he begins to set his sights on this larger goal of unifying Japan under his banner. The documentary talks about how his rule is very, very, very violent. And as he's going on conquest to try to take control of more territory in Japan, he's doing it in a very Mongolian-esque way. The Mongolians of China, when they would conquer other states, they would do it in kind of a slash and burn fashion, like everybody died, kind of thing. And so that's kind of how Oda is kind of carrying out these attacks, is he's just going to villages and he's basically burned them to the ground and not leaving anybody left standing. And it gets to a point where he has this kind of quintessential battle that he fights against a group of essentially warrior monks. These guys are living in a village with their families in the mountains. They're known throughout Japan for being some of the more formidable warriors. And part of the reason they are so formidable is they engage in a type of guerrilla warfare. At this time in Japan, it was very much like in continental or colonial rather America, where you take your armies and you line them up in a row and everybody stands across the field from each other and then they attack, and it's just a bunch of people running toward each other, shooting and slashing in a very kind of bloody and inefficient method of battle. That ended up with lots of high casualties and injuries and all of those things. That's very much the way battle was done in Japan at this time. They were fighting with swords and other metal kind of cutting weapons, axes and things, but they also have kind of inefficient muskets. The muskets were inefficient because they take so long to load, but it is a tool of war that Oda Nobunaga mastered. He basically was the person in Japan to come up with the 3-shot volley, where basically he would take his gunmen and he would have them position themselves in such a way that the first line could fire, and then while they're reloading, you've got 2 other successive squads of men that are firing. So it literally sounds like you've got this nonstop gunfire on the battlefield as they're just firing repeatedly in these 3-shot volleys, and it's very, very, very destructive at that time. And so that's part of what's leading to his success. And so he finds himself against this group that engages in guerrilla warfare, where they don't meet on the battlefield in traditional style, but instead are stalking armies through forest prior to them even arriving at their village and taking people out. It was a very, very, very efficient and effective way for this much smaller force to take on these larger invaders. And so Oda develops a plan and sends his generals out to go and attack this village and bring them to heel. And the battle is very bloody. It goes on for hours. Both sides are losing lots and lots of soldiers and samurai. And when the fighting is done, Oda is the winner. But it's not enough for him to just win. He decides to completely destroy all evidence of this village, of these people. And he has his generals preside over a ritualistic killing of everybody in the village. Man, women, children, doesn't matter. He has them all on their knees as their heads are chopped off by his soldiers' katanas. This was kind of a turning point for one of his generals, a man by the name of Akichi Mitsuhide. He did not feel that the actions of Oda Nobunaga in this case were honorable. And for samurai, honor is one of the most important things in the world. He was basically disgusted by this very bloody, very brutal action taken by Oda. And as a result, he decides that he's not going to continue to just follow blindly his daimyo. And he has his own cohort of soldiers that he's responsible for, that he takes, they're Oda Nobunaga's army, but he leads this army. And so he decides that he's going to get Oda out. He's going to take over for Oda. He could be a better ruler, kind of thing. And so he develops a plan. Oda is fighting battles on multiple fronts. He's got generals in the east and the west all trying to conquer different territories. And as they're working their way west, his army encounters a problem and needs reinforcements. And Akechi is aware of this, and he sees this as an opportunity to take over, to steal power. And basically, what he does is he sends off a message saying, hey, we're getting our butts kicked. We need reinforcements. Send everybody you got. And he recommends that Oda should come too. So instead of staying in his palace, he should come to the front line for this battle. And so Oda gets this communication. He reads through it. He gives orders to get more troops to Akechi's side on this battlefield and let him know that he's going to come soon. He's right behind him, kind of thing. And so this is the opening that Akechi is looking for, because he knows that if he sends all of his remaining troops to reinforce the front, he's going to be traveling himself with a much smaller force. And so Akechi puts together a group of soldiers that are loyal to him, and they go basically and leave the front and meet Oda at a village where he stopped on his travels to the front lines, and he attacks him at night and very quickly overwhelms this small protective force that Oda has with him. And so, trapped, Oda Nobunaga has to make a decision. And the decision that he's trying to decide against is, do I continue to fight and run the risk of being captured, tortured, or killed by my enemy? Or do I take the honorable way out, which is to commit seppuku, or ritual suicide? And ultimately, he decides to go the honorable way. And he commits ritual suicide, thus basically handing the victory to Akechi Mitsuhide, the new man in charge of the Oda clan through defeat in battle. So I'm sure if you're not familiar with Japanese culture, you may not be familiar with seppuku, or ritual suicide. It's really an important part of this overall kind of historical documentation. So we're going to take a break. When we get back, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of seppuku and how it fits in, to this larger context of this documentary. And then we will wrap up the show with my segment, Things I Learned About TV This Week, where we are going to talk about the 93rd Oscars telecast. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC Television Podcast with your host, Chad. Before the break, we were talking about Age of Samurai, the Battle for Japan on Netflix. This is a Netflix documentary, 6 parts, that covers a 65-year period in feudal Japan between 1551 and 1616. And where we left off, the head of the Oda clan, Oda Nobunaga, had just gotten trapped in battle by one of his generals, and he decided to take the honorable way out instead of allowing himself to be captured. He is going to commit ritual suicide or seppuku. So seppuku is plays a very big part in Japanese history. This is a type of suicide that is used by Japanese soldiers, specifically samurai, and is seen as kind of an honorable thing. So seppuku translates to cutting the belly. It was a part of samurai's code of honor. It was used to prevent falling into enemy hands, which would bring shame to the individual. Because if you're captured in battle, you know it's considered shameful because you could be tortured or treated in some way that's not honorable, or killed by the person that catches you in kind of an execution, as opposed to dying in battle, which is seen as an honorable way to go. And in addition to being something that you could do for yourself, it was also a method of death that was allowed as an alternate to execution for disgraced warriors. So in the event that a samurai warrior, was captured in battle, the person who captures them has the option to allow them to have an honorable death. So rather than, putting them in front of a firing squad or hanging them or doing whatever, they could allow those captured soldiers to commit seppuku for themselves, which would bring more honor to their death. The other way that this was used is the daimyo, or warlords, could order their samurai to perform this act as a last act of devotion to their master. So in an instance where this is a scene from the 12th Samurai movie, where they go to battle for their daimyo, and at the end they commit ritual suicide because they were unsuccessful, kind of thing. And it was ordered by their daimyo that don't allow yourself to get caught, just do this thing. And so the act was something that was in their code, but it wasn't formalized. It usually involved taking one of their short swords, which every samurai carried, and they would cut from left to right on their belly. It's a very painful way to die. Disembowelment was part of that kind of process, and it became standardized in the 17th century, where it became more of a detailed ritual. And at that time, in the 17th century, after it was formalized, it was an act that was performed so ritualistically that often there would be spectators if it was a planned execution. And there would be this massive amount of pageantry around it, where the person that was going to be executed would bathe and dress in white robes and would share a cup of sake with their second, and then they would have this very nice ritualistic blade that's wrapped in cloth that they would use. It was a very, very kind of ritualistic thing. One of the key pieces to the standardized process of seppuku is the fact that a second was added. So before seppuku, or up until this time, seppuku was always something you did yourself. You would slice your belly and then oftentimes stab yourself with the knife after that to kind of finish the job. But when it was standardized, a second was added, and the purpose of the second was to stand poised with the katana, the samurai sword, and after you cut your belly, they would chop your head off. The second person was often a friend that was chosen by the person who was committing seppuku. And if not a friend, it could be, the second position could be fulfilled by the person who defeats you in battle. So if I'm a general and I defeated your army in battle and you're going to commit seppuku, I could stand in as your second instead of one of your soldiers or friends, and I would do that as a way of saluting your bravery in battle. So it's a really, really interesting, deeply, deeply historic act that is just steeped in Japanese culture and this ultimate commitment to honor. This practice was not just done by men. Women, notably samurai wives, would perform a version of the practice of seppuku following their husband's death in order to avoid capture. But with women, they would use their tantos or small swords to cut the arteries in their neck, which would assure a very quick death because you didn't want to fall into the hands of the invaders. And oftentimes before doing this, they would tie their knees together because that way, when they were found dead, it would be in a dignified pose instead of kind of sprawled out all over the place. So again, this dignity, this honor is just running through this very kind of brutal and vicious act. I find this to be one of those aspects of Japanese culture that just is extremely fascinating, and it kind of resonates through the culture in small ways to this day. So for instance, sushi chefs who are preparing eel always cut eel from the back. You never butcher an eel from the belly. And that's tied to this kind of seppuku tradition. And so it's just so fascinating to me. But anyway, I digress. So Akichi has taken over the control of the Oda clan, and he is the head for a very short time. Very short. And it's not long before another daimyo that he goes to battle against, Toyotami Hideyoshi, defeats him. And he then becomes the head of the Oda clan and all of the territory that it has conquered up to this point, which is most of Japan. And so that's kind of as far as I've gotten so far in the documentary. Like I said, I'm halfway through episode 4. There's 6 parts. I do plan to finish the remainder of it because, like I said, I find the documentary series interesting. I highly recommend you checking it out. It is called Age of Samurai, Battle for Japan on Netflix. Okay, we are going to wrap this up with a segment I like to call Things I Learned About TV This Week. I was reading through some articles this week, saw 2 of them, one from Deadline and one from Insider about the 93rd Oscar telecast, which will be live on television on the 25th of April. That's a Sunday. Oscars always air on Sunday. For those of you who are not aware, the Oscars is kind of Hollywood's big night. All of the award shows that happen leading up to the Oscars serve as kind of a snapshot into who, the movies and that are most popular and liked the most for whatever reason, whether it's their writing or acting and all of those things. And it honors everything filmmaking. It typically takes place in the Dolby Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. That's just down the street from Mann's Chinese. And it is a big deal. They shut down a large section of Hollywood Boulevard, typically erect all of these seats that spectators can then go and sign up and get chosen in a lottery to sit in and watch people arrive on the red carpet and walk into the Dolby Theater, and there's all the different networks and everything set up. It is a big deal. Jacks traffic up all over Los Angeles, all over Hollywood for at least 2 or 3 weeks because of the shutdowns. It's a big thing. But like everything else, COVID has affected this year's Oscars. And so the articles were talking about a recent announcement that the Oscar committee made to their members and the invited guests. And so I'm going to talk about that and how it's affecting the telecast this year. So a couple of things. First off, they've decided that the Oscars, unlike a lot of the other award shows so far this year, Golden Globes, Critics' Choice, Grammys, is going to be an in-person event. You heard me correct. It's going to be an in-person event. There will not be a host this year. So normally there's an Oscar host. Billy Crystal's hosted the Oscars a lot of times, so has Whoopi Goldberg. Those are some of the ones that are my personal favorite, which is why they stick out in my brain. Typically there is a host that leads us through the awards presentations. That's not happening this year. Instead, the plan is to have several high-profile presenters hand out awards. So they're going to pick a handful of people, and they're going to present various awards throughout the night. The other thing that has shifted is the venue. So it always takes place at the Dolby Theater. The Dolby Theater is going to be used in some way this year. How it's going to be used has not been announced. Instead, they are going to move the telecast to Union Station in downtown LA, which is a behemoth railway station. And it was chosen specifically because it's going to allow for better social distancing for the nominees and their families. So they've made this very intentional decision to have this be an in-person event, but are trying to find ways to make it as safe as possible, and moving the venue was one of those ways. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has informed the community that there will be no option at all for virtual attendance. So if you want to take part in the Oscars, you have to be there present in person. The goal of the Oscar producers is to create a safe and carefree evening where celebrities can relax after a stressful year. So in addition to changing the venue, they're planning to have a specially designed testing cadence to ensure real-time results so that they can ensure that everyone is healthy. They're going to have a COVID safety team on site equipped with rapid PCR tests, as well as several other kind of precautions that they're taking to make this safe. But then they also are instituting a dress code. which I thought was kind of interesting. And the reason they're doing that is, a lot of the other events, they've been virtual events. And so you've had people show up in athleisure, and you've had people wearing pajamas as they accept their awards. And the Academy wants none of it. They are really trying to send a message that Hollywood is back after a historic shutdown of that industry. They're trying to use this as a way of saying, look, guys, we're back, bad and bigger than ever, and we want you to continue to come and see our movies and enjoy our entertainment and all of that. And so they've instituted a dress code that prohibits pajamas and athleisure wear, and they've given specific instructions that the dress for the award show must be inspirational and aspirational. Now, I haven't the slightest idea what that means. I think it'll be really interesting to see what designers come up with for inspirational and aspirational dress as kind of the requirement. But that is the way they're going to play it this year. Personally, I thought it was a really interesting decision. The Oscars is something that I watch every year. When I was living in Los Angeles, used to have a big Oscar party like a lot of people do, and would have friends over, and we would watch the telecast every year. Tons and tons of fun. And now I sometimes we'll get together with friends. Obviously, this year I'll be watching it just with family, but it's always kind of a fun night. And so I encourage you to mark your calendars for April 25th, the 93rd Oscars telecast. All right, guys, that's it. That's our show today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Television Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show. Write a nice review. That really helps me out. Also, if you could please follow on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social medias. Really would appreciate that. As always, I will be posting both the Deadline and Insider article that I referenced during my Things I Learned About Hollywood segment this week on the GSMC podcast Twitter feed. So feel free to check that out. Like, follow, share, and goodbye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Television Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.